What if the place you escaped was never real to begin with? Marcus, a struggling writer, stumbles upon a remote gas station on a stormy night. But what begins as a routine stop turns into a terrifying descent into a supernatural loop. Trapped inside a shifting reality where time resets and memories fracture, Marcus must confront an ancient entity that feeds on his fear, his past, and his very soul. As the rules of survival twist around him, the horrifying truth emerges. He isn't just trapped in the loop, he is the loop. Prepare yourself. This is The Loop Never Breaks. The rain came down like cold needles piercing through the windshield, and my wipers struggled to keep up. My rental Chrysler hummed steadily beneath me as the forest swallowed both sides of the narrow highway. There was nothing but black woods, slick asphalt, and the low thrum of the engine keeping me tethered to something that resembled normalcy. I shouldn't have taken the back roads. Aaron had suggested I fly, but I couldn't shake the old fear of being trapped 30,000 feet in the air with no escape. Ever since 9/11, planes made me uneasy. So here I was, driving 7 hours north from Gold Beach, Oregon to Seattle for my first ever book signing. My debut horror novel had just made it to the New York Times bestseller list, but instead of feeling excitement, all I could sense was a dull anxiety gnawing at my chest. The interstate had been backed up due to an accident, so the GPS rerouted me along an old logging road through the Pacific Northwest. The reception had flickered in and out for the last 20 minutes, and now the navigation screen sat frozen, blinking its confusion at me like a dying eye. "Useless piece of junk," I muttered, giving the dash a frustrated tap. "Enterprise really knows how to rent you top-tier crap." Aaron's voice crackled through the car's Bluetooth. "Everything okay, Marcus? You've gone quiet on me." I exhaled, trying to keep my voice even. "Yeah, just the GPS acting up. But I think I'm still on track." "You better be. The publisher expects you at that signing first thing in the morning. Don't make me send a search party into the woods." I chuckled half-heartedly, noted. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel as I peered through the rain-blurred windshield. That's when I saw it. A soft glow appeared ahead on the right, like a beacon pulsing through the mist. My brows furrowed. A gas station? Odd. The map hadn't indicated any stations for miles. As I approached, the details began to sharpen, but something was immediately off. The old Sinclair logo spun lazily on its squeaky metal pole, a green brontosaurus, its paint faded but still eerily intact. The architecture was unmistakably mid-century. Flat awning, neon tubing, and weather-worn signs advertising oil changes and tire rotations long since obsolete. I blinked. Sinclair hadn't operated stations out here in decades. Had I just stumbled onto some kind of backwater relic? My foot eased off the accelerator as curiosity overpowered caution. The moment my tires rolled over, a thin black hose stretched across the entryway. A loud bell chimed twice, an old mechanical system that I hadn't heard since I was a kid riding in my father's pickup. The rain thinned under the wide metal awning. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly white glow onto the cracked concrete. I shifted into park, letting the engine idle. The rhythmic ticking of the cooling motor accompanied the hiss of rainfall drumming against the tin roof. I waited. No attendant appeared. 10 seconds. 20. A full minute. "Come on," I whispered, growing uneasy. The empty garage bays sat open to my left. In the dim yellow light, I could make out the shapes of two cars elevated on lifts. One appeared to be an old Cadillac, mid-50s model by the look of it, and next to it, a battered International Scout. Neither looked as if they'd moved in years. Tools and oil cans lay scattered on nearby workbenches, but no human presence stirred. Finally, I honked the horn, a sharp, intrusive sound that seemed to ricochet unnaturally in the surrounding silence. The echo lingered a beat too long before dissolving into the hiss of rainfall. Still nothing. I felt a cold shiver climb my spine. The station felt trapped in time, as if it hadn't simply been abandoned, but preserved, waiting. Against better judgment, I unbuckled and stepped out of the car. The frigid air slapped my face instantly, and I flipped up the collar of my jacket against the chill. My shoes squeaked on the slick concrete as I circled toward the office door. That's when I first heard it, the soft creak of hinges behind me. I spun on instinct, my pulse spiking. A man stood by the pump. He was maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, thin but upright, wearing a green Sinclair coverall. The Brontosaurus patch gleamed faintly under the overhead lights, and stitched above his breast pocket was the name Harold. Where the hell had he come from? "Sorry, sir," Harold said, flashing a too-perfect smile. "Didn't mean to keep you waiting." I forced a breath, feeling my heart still hammering. "No problem," I managed with a shaky laugh. "I wasn't sure anyone was even here. Just a little slow getting out for the night shift," he replied, his tone chipper but oddly mechanical. The man's face was pale but unmarred. His slick-back hair clung tightly to his skull, and his eyes, icy blue, seemed almost too bright under the fluorescence. There was something else, too, a strange tautness to his skin, like a wax figure left too close to a space heater. "You need a full tank?" he asked, stepping toward my car. "Yeah, please." I tried to sound casual. As Harold moved, I noticed for the first time that there was a long tear running down the back of his coveralls. Just beneath the circular Sinclair patch, the fabric parted slightly with each stride, revealing glimpses of a grimy white undershirt beneath. Odd, but I said nothing. Harold whistled softly as he pulled the nozzle from the pump. "Nice ride," he remarked, sliding the nozzle into the fuel tank. "Chrysler 300S, right? She's a beauty." "Rental," I admitted. "Company car for the trip." He arched one eyebrow. "Traveling salesman?" "No, actually, I'm a writer." The words came out before I could think to lie. That made him pause, his head tilting with apparent curiosity. "A writer, huh? Well, that's something. Don't get many writers passing through these parts." His smile widened again, too wide. I shifted uneasily. "Yeah, it's for a book signing in Seattle." Harold nodded, eyes glinting. "Let me guess, horror stories." His voice dipped slightly on those last words. I swallowed. "Yeah, horror. Perfect," he whispered. And then, for the first time, the buzz of the fluorescent lights above seemed to dim, almost imperceptibly, but just enough that the shadows around us thickened. The hiss of the gas pump filled the silence between us, but I couldn't shake the weight of Harold's gaze. Those bright eyes watched me with an intensity that felt almost invasive, like he was waiting for something inside me to break. "You know," Harold continued after a beat, "I've always liked horror stories myself. The classics, Lovecraft, Poe. Then there's that newer fella, King, right? Stephen King?" "Yeah," I said, trying to maintain the polite smile, though my stomach had begun to twist. "Big influence." His grin widened, stretching unnaturally before settling again into something more human. "Ever experienced real fear, though?" he asked, voice low now. "The kind that rattles your bones? That stays with you even when you think you're safe?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Not really," I admitted. "I mean, I write about fear, but you don't feel it." His voice sliced cleanly through mine. "Not anymore." The fluorescent lights above flickered again. The rain continued to tap its cold rhythm against the tin roof, but the forest surrounding the station had grown eerily quiet. No distant hum of crickets, no rustle of wind through the trees. Just the two of us in this shrinking bubble of stale light. Harold looked down at the fuel gauge. "Almost done here," he said, cheerful again, as if that momentary shift in tone had never happened. "That'll be 2317. I blinked. "That's it? Prices stay low out here. Small blessings, huh?" He chuckled and extended his hand for my card. I pulled out my wallet, sliding my credit card into his palm. He glanced at the name embossed on it and smiled again. Calmer this time, but still unsettling. "Marcus Damascus," he said softly. "Nice name." "Thanks," I replied, forcing a half nod. "Our card reader's inside," Harold explained, gesturing toward the small office. "I'll just run it real quick if you don't mind." "Go ahead," I said, relieved at the chance to have even a brief moment alone. As he walked toward the office door, I caught a clear glimpse of his back under the flickering lights. The tear in his coveralls was larger than I'd first thought, and as the flap of green fabric shifted with his movement, I could see that what lay underneath wasn't just a dirty shirt. There was something wrong with the flesh beneath. The exposed patch of skin was unnaturally pale, almost waxy, with veins that spidered out in dark, unnatural patterns. My breath caught in my throat. Harold glanced back over his shoulder, as if sensing my stare. His grin returned like clockwork, and he gave a slight wave before pushing open the office door. The bell above it jingled once, then twice as the door slowly closed behind him. Silence descended again. The fluorescent lights buzzed, dimmer now than before. The hairs on my arms stood on end as I stared at the office. Every rational part of me screamed to get back in the car, to leave before Harold returned, but my legs refused to move. Instead, I found myself stepping toward the garage bays. A cold wind swept through the open structure, carrying the faint metallic stench of old oil and rusted tools. I glanced at the Cadillac on the lift. A dusty relic from the mid-50s, its chrome bumper dulled, its tires flat and splitting at the seams. Next to it, the International Scout sat in similar disrepair, as though both had been frozen in time decades ago. I walked further inside, my footsteps echoing sharply against the concrete floor. The workbenches were cluttered with tools that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Wrenches stained with old grease, cans of oil tipped over, their contents dried into sticky black pools. A red rag hung half-fallen from a hook on the wall, stiff as though petrified. The deeper I moved into the garage, the stronger the sensation became that this place hadn't been used in a very, very long time. Then I saw the calendar. Pinned on a rusted nail was a grease-stained desk calendar, its yellowed pages curling at the edges. My eyes locked on the date printed at the top in bold letters. August 1979. I swallowed hard. The year glared at me like a silent accusation. None of this made sense. Sinclair gas stations hadn't existed out here for decades, and certainly not after 1979. A new noise startled me. A faint knock, like something tapping from within the office. I turned sharply toward the sound. The door was closed, but through the front window I thought I saw movement, a shape shifting behind the desk, too tall to be Harold, too unnatural in the way it stretched upward, like fabric pulled tight over something that wasn't quite built to fit it. A chill spread down my spine. The knock came again, louder, and then the lights inside the garage flickered once, twice, and died. The entire station plunged into darkness, leaving only the dim glow of Harold's office window illuminating the distorted shadow within. I didn't realize I was backing away until my shoulders bumped against the cold metal of my car. My hand scrambled for the door handle, yanking it open as I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind me. For several moments I sat there gripping the wheel, breath ragged, heart pounding against my ribcage. The rain outside sounded deafening now, like 1,000 nails tapping on the roof. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. I yanked it out with shaking hands. No caller ID. Against all better judgment, I answered. At first, there was only static. Then, faintly, a voice. A whisper that sent cold shivers racing down my arms. "You should not have stopped." The call disconnected. My hand shook as I stared at the screen, my mind scrambling for any rational explanation. My headlights flickered once. Through the thin film of rain streaking my windshield, I saw Harold standing under the awning again, staring directly at me. He hadn't come from the office door. He was simply there, waiting. And smiling. The rain was still coming down in thick sheets, but I no longer heard it. My pulse drummed louder than the storm outside. Harold stood under the canopy, motionless, staring through the rain-soaked windshield, as though waiting for me to make a move. That grin still stretched unnaturally wide across his face, unwavering, almost carved. I couldn't stay in the car. Every instinct screamed at me to turn the key, floor the gas pedal, and vanish down the highway. But I knew, somehow in the pit of my stomach, that whatever was happening here wasn't going to let me leave that easily. My fingers hovered above the ignition, but locked in place. My breathing grew shallow. Then Harold did something I didn't expect. He raised one hand and waved. Slow, deliberate, friendly, as though we were old friends simply passing time at some midnight roadside pit stop. My skin crawled. The lights inside the office flickered again, pulling my gaze back to that small square of yellow light behind him. I couldn't explain it, but something behind those windows called to me, something my mind refused to fully process. The figure I had glimpsed earlier, tall and stretching like skin over bone, had vanished, yet the lingering dread it left behind hadn't moved an inch, and my credit card was still inside. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat and forced my hand onto the door handle once more. As the door swung open, cold wind lashed across my face, bringing with it the sour metallic tang of old oil and wet concrete. Harold remained frozen beneath the flickering canopy as I stepped back into the rain, my shoes splashing into shallow puddles that reflected his twisted smile. "Just inside," he called to me, voice soft and calm, as though none of this was happening. I nodded stiffly, unable to find words, and walked toward the office door. The bell above chimed faintly as I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with a heavy finality. The air was warmer here, but stale, thick with dust and the faint odor of mildew, like a place sealed off from the world for decades. The room was small. A cracked Formica counter stretched across one wall, with a rusted cash register sitting idly on top. Behind it stood an open doorway leading into a narrow hallway I hadn't noticed from outside. No sign of Harold. A lamp flickered on the counter, buzzing with failing electricity. My eyes caught movement on the counter surface, my credit card, resting beside the register. I exhaled in relief, snatching it up and shoving it into my pocket. For a brief moment, I contemplated running right back to the car, but something kept my feet rooted. The hallway in the back seemed wrong. It extended farther than the size of the small building should have allowed, stretching deeper into shadow, far beyond the back wall. I took an involuntary step forward, my shoes creaking against the old linoleum. The hallway was narrow, flanked by wood paneling stained with watermarks and long streaks of something darker. Bare bulbs dangled from frayed cords overhead, swinging gently as though stirred by a breeze I couldn't feel. I swallowed hard. "Harold?" My voice cracked in the silence. No response. Another step. The faintest squeak echoed. The deeper I moved, the less natural the air became. The temperature shifted, dropping noticeably. My breath misted in front of me, swirling in thin ribbons of condensation. Farther down, doors lined each side of the hallway. Old office rooms, maybe? All closed. No light escaped from beneath them. I don't know why I kept walking. Something compelled me forward. An invisible thread pulling at the back of my skull, guiding me further from the world outside and deeper into whatever this place truly was. I glanced back once to gauge the distance I'd traveled, and froze. The entrance was gone, only darkness remained behind me, as though the hallway had simply consumed the lobby and everything else beyond it. My chest tightened as panic clawed at the edges of my mind. I spun back toward the direction I'd been moving, hoping I could still find some end, any end. The hanging bulbs ahead flickered again, and something shifted behind one of the doors. A faint creak, then the whisper of movement, like skin brushing against wood. I stopped breathing. "Who's there?" I called out, voice brittle, cracking under the weight of mounting dread. Silence. Then, faintly, a voice whispered from somewhere unseen. "You're not supposed to be here." It wasn't Harold. The voice was deeper, lower, wet. I stumbled backward, slamming against the opposite wall, my breathing ragged now, vision narrowing in tunnel focus. The walls felt closer than before, like the hallway was contracting, squeezing me tighter with every passing moment. And the doors? Those damned doors, they no longer looked like simple office doors. Now they seemed older, warped. Some were splintered open slightly, revealing slivers of darkness inside that felt alive, as though something was breathing behind them. The hallway itself had lengthened again. I knew it. The distance back to the lobby had stretched impossibly far, and the far end ahead still retreated like a receding tunnel. I stumbled forward, desperate, forcing my legs to carry me toward whatever end awaited. More doors passed me by, each one different now. Some had names scratched into their surfaces. Others had deep gouges in the wood, as if someone or something had clawed to escape. A sudden cold gust whipped past my ear, and in that instant, I swore I heard another whisper. "You already belong here." My stomach churned. The bile threatened to rise. And then, finally, I reached something. An intersection. The hallway bent sharply to the right, disappearing around a corner. I paused, my hand bracing against the wall, trying to steady my racing pulse. A soft, rhythmic sound echoed faintly from around the bend. Not footsteps, not breathing. Dripping? Steady, slow, like water leaking from a pipe, or blood falling onto cold tile. I didn't want to turn that corner. Every fiber of my being screamed against it. But I knew I would, because I had no other choice. I turned the corner. The hallway narrowed even further, suffocatingly tight, barely wide enough for my shoulders to pass through without grazing the damp, warped paneling. The dripping sound grew louder, more deliberate, as if it were falling directly in rhythm with my heartbeat. Plip, plip, plip. A dim bulb hung above the bend, its faint orange glow casting long, twitching shadows across the walls. The further I moved, the more the air thickened, humid and metallic, tinged with something faintly sweet beneath the mildew, the scent of rot masked by the heavy breath of time. My eyes adjusted to the murky light and landed on a patch of floor a few feet ahead, a puddle. The droplets were falling from above, slow, viscous beads landing in steady intervals. I looked up. The ceiling directly above was cracked, and the drywall puckered and sagging. From a thin tear in the plaster, thick red liquid seeped downward like syrup. I froze, stomach tightening, my brain struggling to register what I was seeing. It wasn't water. It was blood. Fresh. The ceiling above me pulsed slightly with each drip, as though something alive moved just beyond it, heaving gently, exhaling into the space around me. I staggered back a step, feeling the dampness of the air settle onto my skin like a living shroud. The walls behind me groaned softly as if shrinking, forcing me forward, funneling me deeper into whatever this place was becoming. Another door loomed ahead. Unlike the others, this one stood slightly ajar. From inside, faint breathing echoed. Slow, raspy, wet. My hand trembled as I reached out, fingertips brushing the rough edge of the wooden door frame. The surface was cold, unnaturally cold, as if it had been refrigerated for years. I pushed. The door creaked open with agonizing slowness. Inside, the room was small, barely large enough to fit the single metal chair bolted to the center of the floor. Heavy leather straps dangled from its armrests, worn and frayed, as though used countless times. A single bulb dangled from above, swinging slightly, casting shifting shadows across the stained concrete beneath the chair. And there was something else. Pinned to the far wall, illuminated in the weak, swinging light, was a black and white photograph. I stepped closer, squinting. It was a group photo. 3 men stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the gas station, the Sinclair logo clearly visible behind them. Their uniforms were crisp, freshly pressed. 2 of the faces were unfamiliar. The third was mine, or rather, someone who looked exactly like me. I stumbled back, my knees nearly giving way. My vision blurred, breath shortening into shallow gasps. My mind screamed for an explanation, but none came. This was impossible. A sharp click behind me snapped me out of my stupor. The door was closing on its own. I lunged, throwing my shoulder against it just as it slammed shut. My hand found the handle and yanked it open, stumbling back into the narrowing hallway. The air out here felt even colder now, as if my brief entry into that room had awakened something dormant. Behind me, inside the room, faint whispers started to rise. Layered voices speaking in low, garbled tones. Too many voices, all saying different things at once, their meanings drowned beneath one another like overlapping radio signals. He doesn't remember. It's not finished. He was supposed to stay. My legs moved, without permission, dragging me away from the door, back down the corridor that now seemed impossibly long. The more I ran, the less familiar the surroundings became. The hallway warped, its walls shifted, curving unnaturally inward like ribs enclosing around me. The ceiling arched higher, while the floor beneath my feet sloped slightly downward. My steps quickened, not entirely under my control, like I was being pulled forward by invisible strings. And then I saw it. At the far end of the distorted corridor stood a figure, tall, thin, human-shaped, but wrong. The head tilted slightly to one side, its silhouette blending into the gloom as though woven from shadow itself. Its arms were too long, hands dangling just past its knees. I couldn't see its face, but the faint gleam of two eyes caught the swinging light. Pale green, too large, too wide apart. The same eyes I'd glimpsed earlier behind the office window. The figure didn't move. It simply watched me. A low humming sound began to vibrate through the walls, subtle at first, but growing, resonating inside my skull like the hum of deep machinery or a generator spooling up far underground. The floor trembled beneath my feet. I took another cautious step back. The humming deepened. Then, without warning, the figure twitched. It jerked forward, not walking but gliding several feet closer in a single unnatural movement. My heart stopped. I turned and ran. The hallway contorted as I moved, the walls bending in impossible ways. My shoulder clipped one side, sending me stumbling, but I kept going. The lights above burst one by one as I passed beneath them, glass raining down in sharp, stinging shards. Behind me, I heard the creature's gliding approach. Silent, except for the faint scrape of long fingers brushing along the walls as it closed the distance. I pushed forward, lungs burning, vision narrowing to a pinhole of flickering light at the end of the tunnel. Just before I reached it, the hallway opened into a new chamber, an office. I staggered through, slamming the door behind me and twisting the lock, my hands trembling. For several heartbeats, nothing followed. Silence again. I backed away from the door, my breath ragged, the sweat on my back cold against my skin. My eyes darted around the office and froze. This wasn't the front office I'd entered before. It was identical, but not the same. The calendar on the wall still read August 1979. The desk sat perfectly clean, untouched, the old cash register gleaming under the soft glow of the desk lamp. But the most horrifying thing was what sat in the chair behind the desk. Harold. Or rather, something wearing Harold's skin. His smile returned, wider this time, deeper. As if his face could split apart at any moment, Harold sat perfectly still behind the desk, hands folded neatly on the dark wood, his grin stretching impossibly wide. The skin around his mouth looked tight, like thin rubber stretched to its limit, almost translucent under the office's dim yellow light. I stood frozen just inside the door, every instinct screaming to turn and run, but my legs refused to obey. My heart pounded so violently it blurred my vision, each beat echoing inside my skull. "Welcome back, Mr. Damascus," Harold said softly, voice disturbingly calm. My throat tightened. What is this place?" I managed to croak. His head tilted slightly to one side, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something shimmer just beneath his skin, like something moving underneath, shifting uncomfortably inside the suit of flesh. "This place?" Harold echoed, his tone playfully amused. "It's home, Marcus. For both of us." The room trembled faintly beneath my feet, a vibration so subtle it could have been my own terror warping my senses. The shadows clinging to the corners of the office seemed deeper than before, pulsing softly, like living things watching from beyond the edges of light. Harold leaned forward. "You've been here before," he whispered. "You just don't remember." My vision blurred again. a wave of dizziness washing over me as his words sank deeper into my mind. I struggled to focus, to breathe. "No," I whispered, shaking my head violently. "I've never. You were always meant to return," he cut in, his voice dropping into something guttural, as though layered with another voice beneath his own. "You were never supposed to leave." Suddenly, the desk lamp flickered, casting Harold's features into a grotesque mask, his smile elongating even further, teeth gleaming impossibly white against the waxen skin of his face. Behind him, the wall began to ripple. It pulsed like skin stretched over muscle, breathing faintly, warping outward, shapes pressed against it from the other side. Hands, faces, bodies struggling against a thin, veined membrane that barely held them at bay. Dozens of them, hundreds, all trapped behind the wall. I stumbled backward, my spine hitting the doorframe. "What do you want from me?" My voice cracked, desperation breaking through my fragile composure. Harold's grin finally faltered, just enough to expose the thing beneath the mask. His eyes no longer looked fully human, too wide, pupils dilated into thin vertical slits. His skin twitched as something writhed under its surface. "We don't want you, Marcus." His voice now sounded layered, as if several mouths were speaking in unison. "We feed on fear. We savor it. But you were different. You were strong, resistant. The others broke quickly." He gestured toward the pulsating wall behind him. I swallowed hard, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. My breathing became shallow, rapid, the air inside the room growing thinner by the second. "What are they?" I rasped. "Vessels," Harold whispered, almost tenderly. "Failed. Incomplete. But you escaped once." The air seemed to snap around me, like invisible threads pulling tight against my skin. My knees buckled slightly under the mounting pressure. "You survived the sacrifice," Harold continued, voice growing darker. "That's why you returned. The bond was never severed. You left a part of yourself behind, and now you've brought the rest of you back." Suddenly I felt it, a sharp pain slicing through the base of my skull. An explosion of fractured images burst into my mind like 1,000 shards of broken glass. A younger version of myself, screaming. An old wooden altar, soaked in blood. Flames consuming the gas station. Men in robes, chanting in a language I couldn't comprehend. And Harold, younger but still him, standing beside two other men I couldn't fully recognize, grinning as fire reflected off his pale skin. The visions came in quick flashes, too fast to fully process, but clear enough to shred whatever delusions of reality I'd been clinging to. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as if trying to squeeze the images out. My stomach heaved, but nothing came up. The whispering voices returned, louder now, surrounding me, spinning in circles I couldn't escape. "You were always part of it. You were supposed to stay. You broke the circle." I looked up again, my vision swimming. Harold had risen from the chair, standing now with his arms slightly extended. His smile had finally disappeared, replaced by something colder. Anticipation. "This is where you belong, Marcus," he whispered. "This is where you finish what was started." The lights above flared briefly, and for a split second the facade of Harold's human form faltered. His skin seemed to separate like wet paper, and something massive stirred beneath. I scrambled backward toward the door, hand fumbling for the handle. The metal was ice cold beneath my touch, but when I twisted, it wouldn't budge. The lock was gone. The door had sealed itself. I beat against it with my fists, panic rising. The whispers inside the room growing louder, chanting, synchronizing with my own frantic heartbeat. 20, 19, 18. The countdown. The same voice that had whispered through the phone. I turned back toward Harold, toward the thing wearing Harold. Its mouth stretched open impossibly wide, wider than any jaw should have allowed. From deep inside, a faint greenish light glowed, pulsing in rhythm with the countdown. I screamed. It didn't move, it only watched. 17, 16, 15. I slammed my shoulder against the door again and again, teeth clenched, adrenaline surging. The wood groaned beneath the force, but refused to give. 14, 13, my pulse roared in my ears, drowning everything else. 12, and then the surface of Harold's body split open. Not a wound, not a tear, a mouth. A gaping, circular mouth filled with rows of glistening, needle-thin teeth, spiraling endlessly inward, like a tunnel lined with blades. The whispers stopped. Only the countdown remained. 11, 10, 9. The walls pulsed in time with the countdown, as if the entire room breathed alongside that horrific voice. My back pressed hard against the sealed door, my chest rising and falling in rapid gasps. There was no escape, no exit. 8. The thing wearing hair lurched forward. It no longer mimicked human movement, its arms elongated, joints bending at unnatural angles, fingertips grazing the floor like the limbs of some grotesque insect. The skin covering its frame peeled back in strands, revealing sinewy muscle writhing underneath. Wet, glistening, pulsing with life that should not have been. 7! I screamed again, not even recognizing my own voice anymore. This wasn't fear. This was raw, primal terror. My mind had begun to fracture, slipping away under the weight of the impossible. 6. The creature's spiraling mouth pulsed open wider still, the greenish light inside growing stronger. Rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth spun slowly like the gears of an ancient machine designed solely for consuming. 5. The whispers returned, but now they sang. Dozens of voices rising in a twisted harmony, chanting words I couldn't decipher, vibrating in my bones. 4. The air grew heavier. My vision narrowed. The edges of the room curled inward, like the world itself was collapsing into this single moment. 3. I could feel it now, the heat of its breath, rancid and sweet at once, washing over my skin like a fevered wind. The thing hovered mere feet away, stretching toward me with those clawed, fluid fingers. 2. The voice dropped lower, almost purring with satisfaction. 1. Then everything stopped. Absolute silence. The humming walls froze, the flickering light solidified into one steady beam. The creature held its position, frozen mid-lunge, as if trapped in a snapshot of time. For one impossible moment, the world stood still, and that was when the voice came again. But not from the creature, not from the walls, from inside my head. Run! It was my own voice, but not quite. As if someone, some version of me, whispered from deep beneath my conscious mind. I didn't hesitate. The paralysis shattered, and my legs sprang into motion. My hand slammed against the door once more, but this time the metal handle was there. Cold, real. It turned. The door burst open and I stumbled out into the corridor, gasping as if I'd surfaced from drowning. The hallway was no longer familiar. The narrow walls had shifted into grotesque proportions, too high, too thin, their surfaces undulating like flesh beneath translucent plastic. Shadows darted along the edges, figures watching from every corner, their heads cocked in silent judgment. But I didn't stop. I sprinted, breath ragged, feet pounding against the warped linoleum as the grotesque entity screeched behind me. The noise didn't sound like Harold anymore. It was deeper, more guttural, more ancient. As I rounded a corner, the lights above shattered one after another in rapid succession, raining hot glass down upon me. The ceiling above groaned and twisted, beams warping as though under immense pressure. The corridor stretched longer with every step I took, no longer bound by any architectural logic. Doorways flashed past in a blur, some wide open, others sealed tight with chains or boards. In one fleeting glance, I saw something through a doorway. A woman crouched against the far wall, rocking back and forth, her skin pale, eyes vacant. She stared directly at me, but made no sound. Her lips moved, mouthing words I couldn't hear. Then she simply vanished. I ran harder. The entity thundered after me, its movements unnatural, Not footsteps, but a sickening, lurching, gliding motion that devoured space with every pulse. It was gaining. Somewhere deep in my gut, I knew this was no longer about outrunning it. This was about surviving the loop. The layout of the building had become a sick mockery of itself, a maze stitched from memory, nightmare, and something much worse. The farther I ran, the more I realized I wasn't simply trapped inside the gas station anymore. I was trapped inside it. The structure was part of the thing now, or maybe it always had been. My lungs burned as I rounded another corner. And there it was. The lobby, the same front office I had first entered. The cracked Formica desk, the old cash register, the grease-stained calendar still frozen on August 1979. My rental car sat just beyond the glass window, still under the flickering awning lights, the rain outside having finally thinned to a fine mist. For one terrifying second, I wondered if this was another trick, another layer. But I couldn't stop. My body wouldn't allow it. I lunged for the front door and threw my shoulder into it. It opened. The cold air of the outside world struck me like a slap. My chest filled with sharp, frigid air as I stumbled across the wet concrete toward my car. Behind me, the creature screamed, an ear-splitting metallic shriek that made my teeth ache and my legs buckle. The very walls of the station groaned and shifted, windows cracking as the entity raged inside, unable or unwilling to cross the threshold. I slammed into the driver's door, yanked it open, and collapsed behind the wheel. My hands trembled as I reached for the ignition. The key slid in. I turned it. For one dreadful second, the engine sputtered, coughing against the damp night. "Come on," I begged, eyes wide. The engine roared to life, the headlights snapped on, casting long beams into the swirling mists. The Sinclair sign spun lazily overhead, its neon brontosaurus glowing faintly against the black sky. I shifted into drive and hit the gas. The tires squealed against the slick pavement as I tore away from the station, my heart hammering, every nerve on fire. In the rearview mirror, I caught one final glimpse of the front window. Harold stood there again, smiling. Perfect. Unmoving. The rain had thinned to a fine drizzle as I sped away, but the cold still clawed at my skin, crawling through the cracks of the rental's windows. My fingers were locked around the steering wheel, knuckles pale, muscles rigid. Every breath rattled from my chest, shallow and quick. I didn't dare look back again. The highway stretched ahead like a thin, glistening ribbon beneath my headlights, cutting through the endless expanse of towering pines. I kept driving. I didn't slow down. My only thought was distance, putting as many miles between me and that place as possible. I'd escaped, but the silence gnawed at me. My mind wouldn't let it go. The grin on Harold's face, the voice counting down, that impossible hallway, and most of all the photo. The one where I stood shoulder to shoulder with men I'd never met, in front of a gas station I'd never visited until tonight. The farther I drove, the more unease crept back into my gut, heavier than before. I passed no other cars, no mile markers, no lights from distant homes or towns. Just trees, closing in tighter with every passing minute. My eyes flicked to the GPS. The screen was still frozen. No signal, no coordinates. Nothing but a blank blue void blinking uselessly back at me. I cursed under my breath and refocused on the road. The trees broke briefly, opening to a familiar curve ahead. No, it couldn't be. There, just ahead, the neon glow cut through the mist once more. That same green brontosaurus turning lazily atop its squeaky signpost. The Sinclair gas station stood exactly as it had before, untouched, waiting. A chill unlike anything I'd felt before rooted me to the seat. My stomach clenched violently. I slammed on the brakes. The tires skidded, screeching against the wet asphalt as the car fishtailed. The momentum dragged me forward until the vehicle finally jerked to a stop, headlights illuminating the gas pumps once more. The bell chimed, twice, just like before. My breath fogged the windshield as I stared at the impossible scene. The station hadn't simply reappeared. I had never left. No. No. My voice cracked into a whisper. I was trapped. The world outside that gas station, the highway, the woods, even the act of driving away had all been part of the same sick loop, a trick. The entity wasn't chasing me down some road. It was playing with me inside itself. My hands trembled as I shifted back into reverse. I floored the gas, wheels spinning wildly as I attempted to back away from the station, desperate to put it back behind me. The vehicle shuddered, tires screeching, but when I looked up again, my breath caught in my throat. The Sinclair sign loomed above me once more, closer now, directly over the roof of my car. I slammed on the brakes, teeth clenched, sweat dripping cold down my spine. The engine cut out without warning. The headlights died. Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. The dashboard lights flickered weakly, then went dark entirely, leaving me alone in absolute blackness. Then, faintly, a soft tap against the driver's side window. I froze. The tapping continued, gentle, rhythmic. My head turned slowly, against every scream from my instincts. Outside, barely visible through the fogged glass, was Harold, smiling. But this time, his hand wasn't knocking. It was inside. The glass hadn't shattered, hadn't cracked. His arm simply phased through the barrier, fingers curling toward me like an invitation. The world around me twisted again. Trees folding into one another, road fading into black. The only thing that remained real was the station behind him, glowing faintly like a lighthouse, pulling me back into its nightmare. I slapped his hand away and threw open the passenger door, stumbling out into the cold rain, lungs heaving. My feet splashed across the soaked pavement as I staggered away from the vehicle. "Enough!" I shouted hoarsely into the night. Harold didn't move. He simply watched, his arm retreating smoothly back through the window as though nothing unnatural had occurred. I spun around, eyes scanning for any hint of an exit, any break in this endless looping trap. But the forest walls had returned. No road, no path, only endless rows of silent pines, standing like witnesses to my unraveling. I dropped to my knees, teeth chattering, my soaked clothes clinging like a second skin, and then, distant at first, came the voices. They rose softly, overlapping in waves like a choir sung by ghosts. He returned. The cycle remains. You were supposed to stay. The whispers circled me, filling the space above my head, wrapping around my ears like a noose tightening with each breath, and then came the laughter. Low at first, Harold's laugh. But it multiplied. More voices joined in, hundreds, echoing from unseen mouths all around me. Male, female, childlike, ageless, all laughing in perfect sync, as though the very forest mocked my failure. Tears blurred my vision as I clutched my head, rocking in place. That's when I saw it, not directly, but in the corner of my eye, a faint glint of something metallic sticking out from the base of one of the trees. I forced myself up, legs unsteady, dragging my exhausted body toward it. Half buried beneath wet leaves and soil was a small object. A key. Old. Rusted. Stamped with worn lettering that was barely legible under the dim light. Bucker 3. A new surge of adrenaline kicked through me. This was new. A crack in the loop. A way out. Or deeper in. I snatched the key, clutching it tightly in my fist, as if it might vanish like everything else. The laughter behind me stopped abruptly. Only silence remained. And then, softly, Harold's voice floated through the darkness, no longer laughing but cold, almost gentle. "You've found it, Marcus," he whispered. "You're getting closer." The rain began falling heavier once again, and somewhere, far ahead in the woods, faint light blinked once, as if inviting me forward. The key felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of every moment that had led me here. The inscription Bunker 3 burned into my palm, oddly warm despite the cold rain. I stood for a long moment, staring into the woods where the faint, blinking light pulsed, steady and deliberate, like a heartbeat in the darkness. Harold's voice had gone silent again. The entity was watching, waiting. But this This was the first time the loop had offered something different, and that terrified me more than anything. I forced my legs forward, one unsteady step at a time, leaving the ruined gas station behind me. The drizzle thickened into a cold mist that hugged the ground, swallowing my lower half as I moved deeper into the pines. The light blinked again, drawing me like a beacon. The trees grew stranger as I advanced, thinner, taller, their trunks twisting unnaturally as though reaching toward the sky in agony. Some leaned into one another, their roots exposed and tangled like veins through flesh. I walked for what felt like hours, though the pulsing light never seemed to grow closer. The forest around me was no longer entirely real. The air pulsed in waves, vibrating like something living just beneath the surface of the world. The ground beneath my feet grew softer, almost spongy, as if I were walking on layers of decayed matter. And then the voices returned. Not whispers this time, clear. "You've been here before. You walked these woods long ago. You chose to forget." Each sentence hit like a hammer, splitting my skull open from the inside. My vision swam as flashes of broken memories assaulted me again. Ritual fires beneath a midnight sky, chanting in a language I couldn't name, a circle of robed figures, and me, kneeling, eyes wide, screaming. The faces around the fire flickered in and out of focus. Harold stood among them. He was younger, I was younger, and there was something else. Someone else, standing behind me, their hands pressed against the sides of my skull, forcing my eyes open. I collapsed to my knees in the wet soil, clutching my head. The world spun wildly. The memories weren't just surfacing, they were being returned. "You survived the first time," Harold's voice cooed inside my head now, intimate, like breath against my ear. "You broke the seal. That was never supposed to happen. But now we can finish properly." I screamed into the mist. The light blinked again, brighter this time. The pain receded slightly, and I pushed myself upright, staggering forward with every ounce of will I had left. I wouldn't stop now. I had to know what this bunker was, what truth lay behind the curtain the entity so desperately wanted to keep me from. The trees thinned abruptly, the mist cleared, and there it was. A rusted metal hatch embedded in the forest floor, barely visible beneath layers of moss and fallen leaves. Thick iron hinges crusted with corrosion marked its edges, while a single padlock hung from a bolted latch, waiting. The key fit perfectly. As I turned it, the ancient lock popped open with a soft click, like something exhaling after holding its breath for far too long. A heavy groan echoed as I pulled the hatch open. The smell hit me first, damp earth, mold, and something far older. Metallic and sweet, like old blood. A metal staircase descended into absolute blackness. I stared into that void, heart pounding. This was wrong. Every part of me screamed that this was the very heart of the nightmare. But I stepped forward anyway. The hatch door slammed shut behind me as I crossed the threshold. The sound echoed down the shaft, reverberating into the depths like a bell tolling for the dead. My footsteps rang against the metal stairs as I descended slowly, each step groaning beneath my weight. There were no lights. Only the faintest glow leaked from above before vanishing completely as I descended further. When my foot finally met solid ground, I found myself standing in a narrow concrete tunnel. The air was thick, unmoving, stifling like the inside of a sealed tomb. Far ahead, something flickered faintly in the distance, a single bare bulb swinging gently from the ceiling, casting a slow, rotating beam along the narrow corridor. I moved toward it, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have, as though the tunnel itself amplified my every breath, every shift of my weight. The walls were marked with strange symbols, etched directly into the concrete, looping and spiraling like an ancient script that pulsed faintly under the bulb's rotating light. Blood. The symbols had been carved deeply and filled with dried blood. As I moved, I passed old objects abandoned along the sides of the tunnel. Rusted oil drums, broken lanterns, a wooden crate rotted through, and finally, a large framed photo resting crooked against the wall. I stopped. The photo was a duplicate of the one from the gas station office, the same men, the same scene. But the image was older, more worn, the surface scratched and warped by moisture. Except this time, beneath the group stood scrawled letters, "The original vessels, 1979. And again, my face. Clear, unmistakable. "You've always been part of us," Harold's voice whispered again from nowhere. "Your body left, your soul stayed." The light overhead buzzed violently, as if reacting to his words. I stumbled forward again, teeth clenched, my mind spinning dangerously close to breaking. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, circular. Stone pillars lined the perimeter, each wrapped with chains and iron rings, stained dark with dried residue I didn't want to identify. At the center stood a stone altar, crude, ancient, blackened by flame, the heart of the ritual. The air here hummed differently, like standing inside a living organ, every breath and beat synchronized to something massive and buried beneath my feet. As I stepped closer, I noticed a book lying open upon the altar. Its pages were filled with the same looping script, but one sentence stood out, written in shaking English letters. "The loop is the seal." I ran my fingers across the text, skin crawling. A deep, guttural growl echoed behind me. I turned, breath frozen. From the far tunnel entrance, a figure emerged. Towering, thin, limbs impossibly long, its face hidden in the shadow of its elongated skull. But those pale green eyes glowed, watching, waiting. "You've come home, Marcus," it whispered, "at last." The entity stood at the far side of the chamber, tall, impossibly thin, its head grazing the arched stone ceiling. The flickering glow of the swinging bulb revealed the slick, almost translucent skin stretched tight across its elongated frame. The pale green eyes pulsed like twin lanterns, unblinking, fixed directly on me. It didn't advance. It didn't speak further. It simply waited. The weight of its gaze pressed against my chest like invisible hands, tightening with every breath. I struggled to stay upright as my knees threatened to buckle beneath me. The book still lay open on the altar behind me. "The loop is the seal." I reached for it, fingers trembling. The pages were stiff, soaked through with old blood that had hardened like wax, yet the ink beneath remained eerily fresh, as though someone had written it only moments before I arrived. Turning to the next page, I found a list scrawled across the parchment. Rules of containment. Do not enter after dusk. Do not break the circle. Do not acknowledge the vessels. Do not speak the forgotten name. There was a fifth rule, but it had been scratched out so violently that the page tore beneath the pressure, leaving only thin, jagged lines carved into the dried blood. My breath quickened. The rules weren't designed to protect outsiders. They were never for me. They were meant to maintain the seal, to keep it asleep. The entity's head tilted slightly, its neck cracking with a sickening pop, as though its bones were realigning into some new configuration. Its long fingers flexed once, talon-like nails clicking against the stone floor. "You see now," the voice drifted toward me, not from its mouth but from the air itself, vibrating through my skull. "You always knew." I staggered back toward the altar, using it as a crutch to keep from collapsing. "Pay me." My voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Why was I brought back?" The voice chuckled softly, a horrible rasp that echoed off the ancient stone. "You were not brought back," it said. "You never left." The room seemed to constrict around me, the shadows tightening like a noose. The very air rippled under the entity's words. The walls groaned softly, as if the weight of some enormous pressure pressed against them from outside. "You survived the sacrifice," it continued. "Your flesh escaped. Your mind was sealed. But your soul remained bound here, within the loop, within the rules." Suddenly, my knees buckled for real, and I fell hard onto the cold, slick stone. Flashes of memory once again flooded my head in violent bursts. I saw my younger self, barely more than a boy, kneeling on this very altar, surrounded by the chanting, robed figures. I saw the flames of the ritual pyre licking the ceiling. I saw the blade, ancient and curved, descending toward my chest. And then, the circle had broken. I'd escaped. Somehow, impossibly, I had fled before the final cut, before the offering was complete. The ritual had been left unfinished, the seal unstable. I was the breach. You are the crack through which I seep, the entity whispered. The host who carried me outward into the world above, tethered to the flesh but not to time. The loop was created not to contain you. It was built to contain me. The shadows along the walls pulsed again, and I realized for the first time that dozens of eyes stared back at me from within the cracks. Pale, lidless, watching. The vessels. The failed vessels. Faces of others who had come before me, sacrifices that were completed, victims whose souls had never escaped. We failed them. The voice sounded like my own now. The weight of that realization crushed my chest. You want me to finish it, I rasped. You need me to complete the ritual. The entity didn't reply. It didn't need to. Its enormous frame shifted once, that spiraling mouth beginning to pulse and widen, the inner rings of teeth rotating like an ancient grinding wheel. The air grew thicker. The chamber trembled. I was running out of time. My eyes darted back to the book. My fingers flipped frantically through the pages, searching for anything, any line that might break this cycle. Toward the back of the book, scrawled in small, desperate handwriting, I found a passage. A vessel incomplete may become the vessel undone. If the host severs the thread before completion, the seal may collapse inward rather than outward. Collapse inward. A way to break the loop, not by finishing the ritual, by destroying myself. I staggered upright, swaying against the pressure radiating from the entity as it inched closer, gliding rather than walking, its spindly limbs barely touching the ground. The book slipped from my hand. I spoke out loud now, through shaking breath. You don't want me alive. You don't want me dead. You want me bound. But if I die on my terms, the thing shrieked. Not with sound, but with an explosion of pressure that flattened the air around me, throwing my body backward into the altar. My head cracked against the stone, stars bursting across my vision. I slid to the floor, chest heaving, feeling blood warm against my scalp. The creature advanced, closer, its elongated limbs stretching wide now, surrounding the chamber like a spider preparing to consume prey. I reached into my jacket, my hand finding the only real object I still carried from the world outside, the small pocket knife I always kept on road trips. My grip tightened. If I severed the thread, if I could break the loop inward, it might destroy us both, but it would end this. The entity paused as though sensing my intent, head cocked, mouth spiraling wider with that green inner glow pulsing faster now, ravenous. You would throw yourself into the void? It whispered. I raised the knife. I'd rather take you with me. The blade trembled in my hand, slick with sweat and blood. The entity loomed closer, its spiraling maw opening wider still. Rows of needle-thin teeth glistening beneath that impossible green glow, pulsing like a living vortex. You misunderstand, Marcus, it whispered now, no longer amused but almost pitying. Your death does not free you, it only feeds me. The voices on the walls joined in, hundreds of trapped souls murmuring in a sick, mournful harmony. He belongs. He is the key. He seals the loop. The pressure in the chamber grew unbearable. My ears popped as the air itself seemed to bend and fold, warping reality. The ceiling pulsed as though breathing with the same rhythm as the entity's mouth. Still, I raised the blade higher, forcing my hand to steady. I won't let you consume another life, I whispered through gritted teeth. Not mine, not anyone else. Its massive head tilted. You think this defiance is new? The voice shifted again, now softer, older, more intimate. Every vessel resists. Every host fights. That is how the ritual feeds. Fear, struggle, desperation. You bring flavor to the offering. The pressure on my mind deepened like claws digging into my thoughts. Images flooded my vision once again. I saw myself as a child, standing near the altar as men in robes circled around me. I saw Harold, younger, his grin never changing. I saw flames rising, voices chanting, and I saw my own face reflected in Harold's eyes, over and over, as though we were mirrors of the same broken soul. "You're not real," I spat. "You're nothing without us." The entity paused, as though weighing my words. Then it whispered something different, something that made my blood run colder than any horror before. "You volunteered." The words hung in the air like poison. "No," my voice cracked. "No, I didn't. You chose this long ago." The shadow shifted again along the walls. New images formed. Not memories, but pieces of a truth I had buried. I saw papers, contracts, signatures, my own name written beneath ancient symbols. I saw my younger self, not a boy, but a man, desperate, broken, kneeling at the edge of this very altar, agreeing to something I had no way of understanding at the time. "You sought power, Marcus. You sought escape from grief, from failure. You begged for purpose." The voice was inside my head now, gentle, like a lover whispering through the dark. And the bargain was struck. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. Had I come here willingly? Had I been complicit in opening the door to this nightmare? "No," I gasped. "That's not possible." "You chose." The voices grew louder, overlapping, my own voice echoing back at me in twisted reflections, repeating the same words from long ago. "I accept. I surrender. Use me." My knees hit the cold floor again, the knife slipping from my fingers, clattering against the stone. The truth caved in like a collapsing ceiling. The first sacrifice had not failed. The ritual had worked. I had escaped the altar only because my role was never to die, but to carry it outward, to spread the infection, the hunger. I was never a prisoner. I was its vessel all along. The entity inched forward, its mouth humming as the spiraling teeth rotated slowly, savoring the moment. "You were the loop," it whispered lovingly, "and now you return to your place." The green glow intensified, the air vibrating with impossible frequency. The walls began to crack, thin black veins splintering through the stone as the chamber itself seemed ready to rupture. But somewhere beneath the despair, a new spark ignited. Rage. If I had chosen this once, I could choose again. Even if everything else was twisted and broken, I could still deny it this final victory. My hand shot out, gripping the knife once more. The entity recoiled slightly, sensing my intent. "You cannot unmake the contract," it hissed. "I don't need to," I growled. "I just need to end me." With every ounce of strength remaining, I drove the blade toward my chest. But before the steel met flesh, something stopped my hand. Not the entity, not the shadows. My hand hovered in the air, paralyzed. The air around me thickened again, like invisible wires wrapped around my arm, forcing the blade to freeze inches from my heart. It wasn't just fighting my will, it was inside me, controlling me. "You gave me dominion," the voice crooned. "Your flesh obeys." The pressure deepened until my arm buckled, fingers losing grip on the knife once more. The blade clattered uselessly to the ground. "No," I whispered, eyes burning, tears streaking down my cheeks. "No. You belong." The voices screamed in unison. The walls cracked wide now, dozens of hands stretching through the gaps, rotting skeletal fingers reaching toward me, pulling at my legs, my arms, my throat. The chamber vibrated like a living thing on the verge of eruption. The entity loomed larger, its limbs wrapping around the chamber's perimeter, encasing me in a writhing, breathing cocoon of darkness. "You are the seal," it whispered with absolute certainty. "You will endure, and you will feed me for eternity." My scream was swallowed whole. The chamber collapsed into shadow, and then silence. Total blackness. I was nowhere. No longer standing, falling, breathing, just floating. weightless, suspended inside an endless dark that pulsed like the slow heartbeat of a god too ancient to comprehend. And in that void, one final whisper crawled through my mind. Next time, you will not resist. There was no time here, no place, just endless blackness stretching in every direction, a cold, silent void that neither welcomed nor rejected me. My body no longer hurt, my breath no longer existed. I simply floated. How long had I been here? Seconds? Years? The concept dissolved the moment I tried to grasp it, but in the distance, or maybe inside my own mind, there was a sound, a faint ticking, soft, steady, like an old clock counting down inside an abandoned house. Tick, tick, tick. The sound grew louder, and then came the voice, familiar, velvety, Harold. Marcus, it whispered like a parent waking a sleeping child. It's time. Light exploded around me. I gasped as my lungs reignited, my body folding into itself before snapping outward. My back arched violently as though I was being pulled from deep water. I opened my eyes and froze. I was sitting in my car, in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel. The dashboard lights glowed softly in front of me. The engine hummed beneath my feet. Rain tapped gently against the windshield. The road ahead stretched like a silver ribbon beneath the high beams. For a brief, fragile moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything, if it had been nothing but a nightmare. Some elaborate psychotic break induced by stress, exhaustion, or the long drive. But then my eyes shifted upward, and I saw it. The neon brontosaurus spinning lazily above me. Sinclair, the gas station, exactly where it had all started. A cold knot formed in my stomach as the familiar bell chimed softly outside, ding, as though welcoming me back. No, not again. I glanced to my right. The same cracked Formica counter visible through the office window. The same yellowish glow leaking from the old bulbs, every detail perfect. The loop had reset. I never left. I never escaped. Panic surged as I shoved open the driver's side door and stumbled into the rain, feet skidding slightly on the slick pavement. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned, scanning the scene, searching for anything out of place. But everything was exactly as it had been. The gas pumps, the road, the forest, the silence. No! My scream cut through the drizzle. My fists pounded against the hood of the car until my knuckles burned. And then, movement. From the corner of my eye, the office door creaked open slowly. Harold stepped out under the awning. Same green jumpsuit, same polished shoes, same hollow smile. Marcus, he greeted me, his voice syrupy smooth as though this was the very first meeting. Rough night? My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a continuation. This was a perfect replay. The loop didn't just trap me, it erased me. Every cycle was a clean slate, resetting the world while leaving me trapped in an endless déjà vu of my own making. But this time, I remembered. You, I growled through clenched teeth, pointing toward him. You're not Harold. His smile never faltered. You always say that, he said softly, and yet here you are. The wind shifted and the smell hit me again. That faint metallic sweetness beneath the damp earth. It had been there all along, like the scent of the thing hiding beneath his skin. I staggered backward, trying to distance myself from him, from this entire cursed place, but no matter how many steps I took, I remained rooted inside the same invisible perimeter. The loop was spatial now. It kept me inside its orbit, like gravity holding a planet hostage. You cannot leave, Marcus. Harold's voice echoed. The contract remains, the seal holds. You are necessary. The rain thickened into a steady downpour, streaking my hair against my face. I could feel it again. The pressure against my mind, the pulsing hum that vibrated beneath my feet. The entity was still here, always watching, always feeding. From me. You said I volunteered, I hissed, that I asked for this. You did. His voice dropped lower, almost tender. You may not remember why, but that does not change what. I shook my head violently. There has to be a way out. There is, Harold whispered. Surrender. The word struck me like a slap. Submit, he continued, his voice almost comforting now. Accept your place, and the struggle ends. No more pain, no more fighting. You will become part of the rhythm, endless, perfect, whole. The neon light flickered above us. The bell chimed again. The world seemed to pulse, breathing in rhythm with his words. You are the loop, Marcus, he said one last time, stepping closer. Stop resisting. Let the seal complete itself. The weight of exhaustion pulled at my limbs. Part of me, God help me, wanted to say yes, to stop the fight, to let go, but somewhere deeper, far below the fear, a spark flickered, the memory of my own voice. I'd rather take you with me. I clenched my fists again, feeling the sting of raw knuckles. Not yet, not like this. Then we start again, I whispered through gritted teeth. Harold's smile stretched just slightly wider. As many times as it takes, he replied. And behind him, deep in the woods, the faint green eyes opened once more, watching, waiting, hungry. The rain pounded harder now, cold needles biting into my skin as Harold's words hung in the air. The world pulsed with every breath I took, vibrating like a taut string stretched to its breaking point. I stared at him, chest heaving, my vision blurred by rain and exhaustion. Around us, the gas station flickered again, its walls bending slightly, as though the structure itself was breathing along with the entity inside it. This place wasn't just a location, it was a living system, a parasite feeding on me, adapting to my every attempt to break free. Every loop, every scream, every failure. The more I resisted, the stronger it grew. Why? I finally rasped. Why this? Why keep me here? Harold's head tilted slightly, that impossibly wide grin never faltering. The shadows under his eyes deepened. Because, he said softly, you are not just the host. The world vibrated again. You are the seed. The words hit me harder than anything before. Seed. I felt my stomach tighten as realization dug into my bones like rusted hooks. I hadn't just carried the entity outward. I had spread it. The contract I signed, the ritual I once begged for. It wasn't simply binding me to this thing, it was planting it inside me, allowing its corruption to grow outward into the world each time I stepped beyond these cursed walls. Every cycle wasn't just containment. It was replication. The ritual never sought one sacrifice. It sought many. Every time I escaped, I unknowingly carried its spores into the world. A piece of the entity spreading through time, through others, through every person I'd spoken to, every book I'd published, every interview, every signature scrawled across my novels. I had become its vector. The ritual wasn't failing, it was succeeding. You see now, Harold whispered, stepping closer. Your struggle was never against us, it was against yourself, against what you unleashed. My legs buckled. I dropped to my knees, the cold concrete burning against my skin. My hands trembled violently as the weight of it all crushed my chest. Every mile I had driven, every fan who shook my hand, every word that left my mouth, all had carried the infection outward. You were never meant to escape, Harold continued. The loop is mercy, the loop is control. Here, we contain you. But out there, he gestured into the distance beyond the trees, toward the world I thought I'd once returned to. Out there, it grows. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. And then, as if sensing my final flicker of hope extinguish, Harold leaned down, whispering gently, almost lovingly into my ear. Let us end your burden. The words were not a threat, they were an invitation, a seduction. The rain slowed suddenly, as though even the sky held its breath. The neon sign stopped spinning. Time froze once again. And behind us, within the station's skeletal frame, the walls finally tore open, splitting like rotted flesh as the entity revealed its true form. Massive, endless, its limbs coiled like serpents around the shattered roof, its spiraling mouth opening wide toward the heavens, rows of teeth rotating like grinding stone wheels. A green glow pulsed out in waves, rippling the sky itself. The eyes, those ancient crescent-shaped eyes, locked onto me. I felt my own body twitch under its influence. It was pulling me. Not physically, not even mentally. It was pulling at my soul, my will, my surrender. The loop had played its final card. You belong to us. The voices of 1,000 vessels sang from inside the creature's gut, their mouths open in unison. Become one. I closed my eyes, I felt my breath slow, and for a brief moment, I let the weight lift, let my mind slip. It would be so easy, so warm, so quiet. But then, a whisper rose from somewhere deeper than even the entity could reach. Remember. It wasn't a voice from the entity. It was me. Some fragment that had never yielded, some sliver of marrow-deep defiance. You already chose once. You can choose again. My eyes snapped open, and for the first time I stopped fighting the loop, not by surrendering, but by accepting. The only way to weaken the loop was not to escape. It was to feed it corrupted data, to refuse to act the same, to break its pattern. My voice cut sharply into the void. I accept. The entity paused. The spiral of teeth slowed. Harold's smile froze. The voices fell silent. But I choose to stay inside this loop, I continued, my words strengthening with each breath. Without fulfilling the ritual, without spreading you, without breaking, I will remain here in this decaying echo, feeding you nothing. The entity twitched, as if struck. I stepped forward, no longer trembling. You need my fear. You need my struggle. You need me to fight or surrender, but I choose stagnation. The world shook violently now. Cracks spiderwebbed across the station. The forest trembled. The green light pulsed erratically. Harold's face contorted, twisting unnaturally, his features slipping between dozens of stolen faces. Mine, others, strangers, lost souls. No, he hissed. You cannot. But I already had. I sat down on the soaked pavement, folding my arms. I will rot with you. The entity shrieked. A sound that tore through the air like the fabric of reality splitting open. The walls collapsed inward, the forest inverted, the sky blinked out, and then darkness. But not the void, not the formless place I had floated in before. This was different, muted, silent, still. A cocoon of nothingness, holding both of us trapped together, frozen outside of time. And in that eternal pause, a final thought echoed quietly through what remained of my mind. Let it starve. Thank you for joining us on this unsettling journey into the loop never breaks. Sometimes the scariest horrors aren't the monsters hiding in the shadows, but the choices we made and the truths we try so hard to forget. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow horror fans. Your support helps us bring more terrifying tales from the darkest corners of the mind. And always remember, not every door should be opened, not every truth should be uncovered, and sometimes, survival is just another form of captivity. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, but beware the things that lurk where logic ends.